Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott McKenzie. I'm Director at Coleago Consulting, and it's my pleasure to be speaking to you this afternoon about about valuing and assigning millimeter wave spectrum. I'm conscious of the fact this is one of the last presentations of the day, and I'm one of the few things between you and the rest of your evening. So I'll make this mercifully brief. We'll have about 30 minutes of presentation, and then I'd like to open it up for a Q&A session. So if you could perhaps at the end of the session type your Q&A or your questions on the chat, then we'll attempt to answer them. My business partner Stefan Zähler will also be joining me for the Q&A at the end. Before we begin the session, I just wanted to shamefully plug my company, which is Coleago Consulting. Some of you may not know who we are. We're a TMT strategy company with a very heavy focus on the telecoms industry. We do a lot of work in spectrum and valuations, a lot of work in regulatory and policy areas, as well as network sharing, and strategy, business planning, and transaction services.
Scott, are you able to go full screen on your slides, please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thanks very much. That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are experts in spectrum issues, having worked on some 80 awards globally over the years. And we probably work on about 8 to 10 major spectrum projects per year. We do work for a variety of customers, both operators and regulators. Although I would say we've probably spent more time with operators over the years. Just before we go on and talk about millimeter wave valuation and allocation, I wanted to just dwell for a minute on the sort of background to all of this, and particularly 5G and millimeter wave background, and some of the more general industry issues that affect the sort of operator community. First of all, I don't think I've been to a country in the last 3 years that hasn't at some point said that they want to be a leader in 5G. In developed countries, people see this, policymakers see this, politicians see this as a way to maintain their economy and to continue to grow their economy. And at the same time, developing markets many developing markets are very strongly interested in 5G, as they see this as an opportunity to catch up in what they consider to be the fourth industrial revolution. So there's a lot of interest from policymakers around the world, and they are pushing 5G very heavily. As I said, every country is very keen to do that. At the same time, we're continuing to see rapid growth in mobile data traffic all around the world, in all the regions of the world. This is a report published earlier this month by Ericsson. And essentially, it's forecasting anything up to, depending on what region of the world you live in, anything up to a 5-fold increase in mobile traffic between last year and 2025. And part of this increase is due to the adoption of 5G, because it's well known that when you get more efficient technologies with more capacity, cheaper capacity, then that encourages consumers to use it more. We saw that with both 3G and 4G. But we're also seeing significant growth in usage even for 4G users in most markets. And the underlying increase in usage is largely being driven by video applications, and that's a consistent theme in all markets. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic is also having an impact. We've got more remote and home working. There's more video communications are happening. People are getting more used to using the technology. It's true to say mobile networks are less affected than fixed are, and it's also true to say that traffic in residential areas is growing more, obviously more than in business areas where with all the people working at home. But that is something that is definitely going to have an effect. And this, these projections, again from Ericsson, they were prepared after the outbreak of the global pandemic, so they do factor some of that in. Regulators are at the same time obviously very keen to push the 5G agenda, and they are allocating a vast amounts of spectrum. Until probably 2 years ago, most operators probably only had about 500 megahertz worth of spectrum. It's already quite a bit. But in the next sort of three years or so, 3 or 4 years, we're going to see an increase of 5.5 times that amount of spectrum. A large chunk of it will come in the upper mid band, a sort of 3.5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz spectrum range, but quite a lot of it is going to come in the high band. This is a chart for a typical European operator. So operators are going to have a lot more spectrum to play with in order to help them provide the additional capacity and performance that customers are requiring. And 5G offers, as everybody knows, there's been a lot of interest in all the different 5G applications. It's certainly a very interesting technology. The business case, of course, is still not clear in many cases. But the 5G vision, which I think most of you will have seen with the 3 corners, a triangle, well, we actually think that has 4 corners. And the 4 corners really are capacity, coverage, reliability, and resilience. And you really do need a mix of spectrum to provide these capabilities. And we see that, for instance, enhanced mobile broadband, you do need, or it will be necessary in certain locations, certain applications, to have very high, extremely high data rates, and the mmWave frequencies are particularly useful for that. And that's the top right-hand corner of the chart there. And we will need a variety of different spectrum resources. So sub-1 gigahertz spectrum, obviously very important for the coverage layer, for providing coverage for enhanced mobile broadband. That's similar to what we have today with LTE. You'll have you need good indoor coverage and also massive IoT. If we're going to have machine-to-machine communications, there needs to be a very large coverage layer, clearly, which obviously offers a lower throughput and capacity due to the narrower bandwidth available. Then to go up the frequency range, 1.5, 2.6 gigahertz, some of the existing mobile bands. We need urban coverage layer, again, for mobile broadband, indoor massive IoT, and this provides much more capacity for the operators. And then we get into the really interesting capacity bands for 5G. So the 3.3 to 5 gigahertz bands, providing 100 megahertz wide channels, which provide much larger, much more capacity, a stronger capacity layer, and importantly, much lower latency for some of the mission critical services that are being thought of, such as ultra reliable, low latency communications. And then finally, the mmWave spectrum. And here you really have potentially huge amounts of capacity, but obviously with a very limited range due to rather poor propagation characteristics. And you can have anything up to an 800 megahertz wide channel per operator. So it can provide multiple times the capacity of even the the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, for example, and even lower latency levels, less than a millisecond. And these will be used in quite special areas, and we're going to come to that in a second. Against this, we see that the device ecosystem is expanding, the 5G device ecosystem. We're starting to see the first devices, they came through in the sort of first and second half of last year, and they continue to grow. There's more devices available in all of the various bands. We're starting to see some of the mmWave devices coming through as well, and I think there will be a lot of growing interest and growing number of devices available. And in fact, I think the ecosystem is one of the things. Usually, it's the last thing to be in place. The infrastructure can be rolled out usually more quickly than the ecosystems develop. Generally, looking at the operator industry, one of the things that they see is that there's a significant growth in traffic, as we mentioned, but at the same time, there's actually very little revenue growth. In fact, they're lucky if they're really managing to hit inflationary levels of growth. And so in real terms, the actual revenues are declining in many markets. And of course, while the consumer is the winner in that case, and we, this is one of the biggest challenges of the for the operator community, is that their business is constantly under pressure. They've got to deliver more and more capacity, more and more bandwidth, more and more traffic, and yet they can't charge very much more for it. It may be in some markets they're lucky to increase prices, but that's very, very rare. And we see this. If you look at the tariff packages that have been announced for 5G, this is some analysis we did last year on the introduction of 5G in Korea, for instance. We looked at the different packages that Korean operators were introducing. This is LG. If we look at the prices and the data that was being offered, the amount of data and the speeds, basically the 5G tariffs were actually on average cheaper than the 4G tariffs, and you're getting more data for the same amount of money. So this is a consistent theme. So we don't think that there's going to be a massive, initially at least, price premium for 5G. There may be in some potential applications which are very specialized, but for the general mobile broadband mass consumer market, this is going to be a significant issue. And the operators are going to face a big challenge. And this, basically is reducing the return on investment for many operators. Profit margins have been in decline for many years, and at the same time, capital employed, the network investment and spectrum investments are increasing, and industry returns are declining. And per megahertz license fees, in our view, must decline, or 5G deployment will be reduced or delayed. And this is a chart of how the sort of cash flows work for a mobile operator. And if the upfront prices paid for spectrum licenses or the annual spectrum fees continue to go up, then there simply will be less cash available to invest in the business to generate a consistent return. And so operators will be forced, if they're forced to pay excessive spectrum fees, to slow or defer their network investments. And the risks, I would say, for the operator community are increasing. There's very uncertain revenue growth. Spectrum costs are going up, and there's uncertainty over renewal conditions and prices in many markets. And new network investment is definitely going to be required for 5G. Many operators still haven't made a return on 4G yet. And the business case for some of these new services like IoT or fixed wireless access, well, that's not so much a new service, and millimeter wave applications are still uncertain. So from the operator's perspective, there's a lot of concern about the potential costs of all this and the impact on their business. Valuing millimeter wave spectrum, well, basically when an operator is looking to acquire spectrum, really in spectrum auction or an administered process, there really are only three questions they have to ask themselves. How much spectrum do they want? What is the value of the spectrum, and how do they go about obtaining it at the right price? And the aim of all of this, from their perspective, of course, is to preserve shareholder value. And when we're valuing spectrum, the same rules apply to millimeter wave spectrum as apply to other bands. We have to work out the value of the business with the spectrum and the value of the business without it. So what would they do differently if they didn't win that spectrum? And then this, if we work out the net present value of the future cash flows of the business, then we can compare that, and we can work out what the maximum value of the spectrum is to the operator in a given situation. And then hopefully if they acquire it in an auction or they buy it in an administered process, then they can acquire it for less than its value. Otherwise, they would be destroying value and they wouldn't acquire it. We always believe it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. There's a lot of complexity, and people can build a lot of complexity into these models, and we would advise clients to think very carefully about this and focus on the key issues. We typically develop a 10, 15 or 20-year forecast, depending on the license term of the spectrum. You can, some clients look at putting a terminal value into the calculation to calculate the value of the spectrum or the business in perpetuity, because even at the end of the license period, there probably will be some residual value. There will be some residual value in the business, although including a terminal value makes it more complicated, because you have to think about what the potential renewal fees will be a long way in the future. To value spectrum, we need to define and quantify the sources of value of the different bands and the different blocks that are on offer. And if you look at the different characteristics of the spectrum, obviously sub-1 gigahertz gives you excellent coverage. Obviously, millimeter wave doesn't offer such good coverage. It's perhaps 100 to 200 meters from a microcell. It might be about the extent of the coverage you will get. However, millimeter wave spectrum offers a much higher throughput. It offers much better latency. It's probably less. It offers you less mobility, and it certainly gives you a lot more system capacity. And in general, when we do a spectrum valuation, we consider all of the factors on the right, because spectrum holds a number of intrinsic values which you also have to think about. So, for instance, can you get a marketing advantage by having a better user experience? Well, clearly, in certain locations, millimeter wave could deliver much higher speeds and could give you cheaper network capacity. It could offer you new opportunities with, for instance, fixed wireless access. We need a lot of quite cheap capacity. And there are other values as well. For instance, a marketing value of blocking a new entrant. And what we find is that marketing values tend to be the ones that have the biggest impact on the value of the spectrum. There are also technical values which are very important. So, if we have the right mix of spectrum, we can reduce our cell site build. So we can reduce the amount of sites we have to build, so that reduces the cost of the network. We could, millimeter wave, for example, could be used to reduce the amount of fiber we have to build in the backhaul. So that could be a very important cost saving. It could be cost avoidance in transitioning to 5G new radio. That's not so much an issue for millimeter wave. And for fixed access, we can avoid fiber build. So it offers the opportunity of going to fixed wireless access services. And just to summarize the sort of business cases for millimeter wave spectrum, these are the sort of uses that we see in the modeling that we've been doing on millimeter wave spectrum. I'm sure there will be others that will come along, but initially one of the early ones was fixed wireless access. The rationale is a lot cheaper to build with millimeter wave than running fiber into a building, and given you can offer, you know, gigabits per second of download speed, it's a good substitute potentially for fiber. Obviously, there are issues of propagation losses, and you know, you can have rain attenuation and things like that, which are potential issues. But clearly, there is a strong possibility to save costs. The other thing that it's been proposed for a small cell backhaul, so backhauling small cells where you need to provide lots of localized capacity, again cheaper than providing fiber, and a lot simpler. So so that's potentially an interesting application that many of our clients have been looking at. Millimeter wave's also been proposed for providing 5G connectivity in dense and high traffic indoor areas. So, for example, you know, obviously downtown areas, high traffic outdoor, but also sports stadiums, malls, and transportation hubs, for example. Although at the moment, obviously, the business case for that is not looking so great with the COVID-19 pandemic, which clearly with people not wanting to congregate in large groups at the moment. But eventually that will, of course, come back. And really, if we want to be able to deliver the highest area traffic density in these sort of outdoor sports arenas or indoor transportation hubs, then we really do need the millimeter wave. And this is some modeling we've been looking at, for instance, on the area traffic density in megabits per second per meter squared. And the chart on the left is from the ITU. And in order to get to the sort of 10 megabits per second per meter squared that you really require, you really do need millimeter wave spectrum, and we've done some simulations of that, some capacity simulations of that. In order to produce valuations, once you have worked out how to model all of this, we have a technical model suite which we can use, and commercial model suite to simplify the process. So we gather up all the main inputs about the existing network and the future strategy and plans, as well as the business assumptions that are going to go into it on the different applications, different segments of the market. And we have actually a two-part model suite which we've developed, and generally speaking, this is a sensible way to split it. We have a commercial module and then a net module. The net module does all the network modeling, so it really looks at the network strategy. The commercial modeling obviously models up the revenues and looks at the commercial marketing advantage you could get in certain spectrum scenarios. And then on top of that, you need to be able to run many hundreds of spectrum scenarios potentially if you were going into a spectrum auction, and be able to adjust the assumptions quickly and run sensitivities and so on. So having analysis tools is very important. So we would recommend, if anybody was going to value spectrum for a large auction or even an administered assignment, that they ought to be looking to do a valuation along these lines. I just want to say one thing: spectrum valuation is a bit different to normal business planning, because we're obviously looking at very long-term forecasts, and it's more about sort of judgment than necessarily lots and lots of detailed analysis. And it's often determined by relatively few variables. And one, as I mentioned before, it really is better to keep it precise, roughly right than precisely wrong. So, and it's not the same. Spectrum valuation is not the same as budgeting, because it takes place at a much higher level of detail. It doesn't involve necessarily doing lots of tariff analysis or market planning. It doesn't always involve detailed radio network planning, although sometimes that could be used as an input, because the idea is we need to be able to develop these or calculate these valuations quite quickly. And if you have to constantly go back and do a full radio plan for a whole country, then that is not practical. So now I'd like to turn to the last topic on allocating millimeter wave spectrum. So far, there've been a limited number of auctions of millimeter wave spectrum, at least during the 5G era, and those basically have taken place over the last 2 years. Essentially, there've been 6 auctions, and 2 of them taken place in the US, where there has been the greatest interest in millimeter wave spectrum. And the large telcos in the US, apart from Sprint, have all acquired spectrum, as have a number of local operators, and even some fixed wireless access startups have also been buying spectrum. There were 2 auctions in 2019 and 24 and 28 gigahertz in the US. And the US auction was the only one really where the spectrum sold at levels above the reserve price. If we look at all the other auctions, Italy, South Korea, which were in 2018, and Taiwan and Thailand, which have been more recently, then generally speaking, the winners have paid a small amount over the reserve. And in fact, there's been in many markets, some markets, there've been a number of blocks of spectrum that have gone unsold. So, and in fact, in Hong Kong, the Communications Authority in Hong Kong, they actually concluded that there would be insufficient competition for the spectrum that they held in the 26 and 28 gigahertz band, and they went for an administered assignment and basically decided to give the spectrum away for free. And they awarded 3.7 gigahertz of spectrum for the provision of mobile services, and there was a cap of 800 megahertz on each operator. They also provided some 400 megahertz of spectrum on a shared basis for the provision of localized wireless services, including fixed line. And 3 of the 4 main operators in Hong Kong acquired spectrum in this process. But what was interesting was that one of the major operators there, 3, did not actually participate. They actually didn't see any value in acquiring this spectrum, at least not at this stage. There were some coverage requirements associated with the spectrum, and it may have been that 3 didn't see any value in the spectrum given the coverage requirements. And they may also perhaps think that they can acquire more spectrum later, given that a large quantity of it went unsold. So we would think that regulators need to be very careful about think about their policy objectives for assigning spectrum. We saw early on in the 5G spectrum auctions that there was an attempt by many countries really to prioritize revenue generation by maximizing auction proceeds. We saw some quite eye-wateringly expensive auctions in for instance, Italy and Germany, here in Europe, really, regulators need to think carefully about their policy objectives. They need to think about what it is they're trying to achieve. So, you know, are they trying to promote investment and innovation, you know, promote rural broadband access, promote competition and customer convenience, or are they going to really focus on short-term revenue generation? They could, of course, in auctions and assignment processes, they could decide to make the spectrum more scarce by not releasing all of it at the beginning. We think that would be potentially an error. And as I mentioned before, if regulators do try and gouge the industry, then clearly it will have a knock-on effect on industry investment. And regulators also need to think about other things aside from the facts we've just talked about, to spur the growth of network investment. So facilitating net spectrum trading, increasing license duration, allowing operator spectrum pooling, for example, and allowing, you know, new types of licenses to be allocated, so unlicensed and shared spectrum licenses, for example. But there are also very important things for millimeter wave utilization, harmonization rules for site building, you know, access to street furniture, way leaves for small cell installations and the like, and the role of regulation of wholesale infrastructure providers, because clearly there is a potential role for a wholesale provider of a small cell network in various locations. So in summary, regulators in many markets are grappling with the challenges of assigning millimeter wave spectrum, and I would say operators are grappling with how to value it. The abundance of this type of spectrum means that demand may not exceed supply, and so auctions may not necessarily be the most appropriate response in terms of how to allocate the spectrum. It may be that there will be more administrative assignment processes. There may be even beauty contests coming back. We think regulators do need to be more flexible in their choice of award mechanism, and perhaps think more carefully about the terms of the license conditions, as I mentioned. And they do need to make sure that spectrum trading can happen and be facilitated. That will be important for ensuring the spectrum is used as efficiently as possible. So now I'd like to start taking questions from the audience.
Question there from Simon Pike about practical consumer applications for FWA.
Yes. Okay.
So shall I take that?
Yes, by all means.
So Simon's question basically, are there any practical consumer applications for millimeter wave apart from FWA? I think the key thing is that millimeter wave will be used as one of the spectrum resources to serve those points where you have a very high demand in an area. So it's not a specific application that will be served, but it is the aggregate demand in a very small area. And that could be typically indoors, but it could also be outdoors, for example, at a very busy road junction. And if you add all of this up, so demand from people, demand from all these new applications, including network slicing, you actually come to a situation where you have to serve, or all mobile operators together have to serve that 10 megabits per square meter. And to do that, you need the millimeter wave spectrum. Otherwise, it's not practical to do it in any other way. You also mentioned your question also related to penetrating buildings from the outside. That's not possible. So you'd have millimeter wave either outdoor or indoor deployment, discovering those specific locations.
And Simon, also thank you for your word of caution on the spider diagram. Yeah, I think like many things in spectrum, it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. So we take your suggestion there on board.
We've got another question here from Köln de Troya. I'm not quite sure. Are you a regulator? Proximus, strategy manager. There we are. So what would be an appropriate timing to make the spectrum, millimeter wave spectrum, available?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, there's a lot will hinge on the development of the ecosystem, and having devices that can use this spectrum. We are starting to see, obviously, millimeter wave devices that can support millimeter wave coming along. But I think in the next year or two, we're going to see more millimeter wave spectrum being allocated. And I think if you award it too early, then clearly, the operators won't see, the value in it. So yeah, it's. I think Mark Colville's just made a comment saying that it's a balancing act, and indeed it is. So, but I think definitely the next few years, the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see a lot more millimeter wave spectrum allocated. So.
Yeah, and I'd add that, for example, I mean, I think it was 3 days ago, Lenovo launched the first 5G laptop, which actually has a chipset which supports millimeter wave. So it's happening. It's there in North America. There are an awful lot of devices that support millimeter wave. The question really is, if the spectrum is sitting there in regulator's inventory, you might as well assign it. If the focus is not on raising cash, but on allowing operators to deploy it, even to experiment with it, then I'd say assign as early as possible and charge as little as possible for it.
Yeah. We've got a question for Radine Renner. What will be the best mix of spectrum, millimeter wave, low and mid-range, and in both, sorry, just clicked up, I just lost the question there, and in both bands and bandwidth for a basic realistic 5G rollout? Well, that will depend very much on what you're trying to achieve and who you are and how much traffic you've got and so on. But really, you need a mix of spectrum. You are going to need, if you're going to be a national mobile operator, you're going to need a mix of sub 1 gigahertz spectrum, mid-range spectrum, up to including 3.5 gigahertz, and all the way, and then millimeter wave spectrum. Obviously, the quantities you'll need will vary, but depending on on exactly how much traffic you're trying to cover.
Yeah, I think the key business case for 5G is to lower the cost per bit. And so the more spectrum you have and can get into a single radio, the better. The current radios in mid-band are defined up to 100 megahertz wide, but 200 megahertz is coming along. In millimeter wave, we have, I believe, is it 400 megahertz in the single radio? And certainly it's not going to end there. The channel bandwidth is 400 megahertz. So it's those sort of economics that makes it very attractive for operators to deploy in areas with a very high traffic density. Yeah.
Okay. There's a question from Martin Rota. Hello, Martin. I haven't spoken to you for many years. Are there any recommendations or analysis you are aware of assessing the impact of synchronization issues in adjacent TDD networks in millimeter wave bands. Presumably the problem is minimal if one of the licensees is local and indoors. Well, that's certainly true. I personally am not an expert on that particular topic. I've looked at synchronization for other 5G bands, but not specifically for millimeter wave. Stefan, have you got any suggestions?
Well, I think synchronization is an issue if the spectrum travels reasonably far. So I think perhaps we have to differentiate it between indoor and outdoor deployment. So it might be possible. I mean, synchronization, the problem was addressed earlier in the conference, synchronization with regards to verticals. I think Daniel from the GSMA made that point, and it's a huge problem if you're looking at the C-band. And I think in millimeter wave, it is probably not that big of a problem because it naturally, the range is limited, it doesn't go through walls and so on. So you could imagine that this issue, although it's in theory present, in practice, is that it doesn't matter so much. But I don't know that with certainty, and it certainly depends a lot on the deployment scenarios. Having said that, there's there are many, many bands. And you could say, okay, here's a band which we assign to operators who are used to synchronizing, so that's not a problem. Here's another band which we assign to verticals.
Well, I think also, I mean, perhaps Martin, we can speak offline on this. We looked at quite a lot of synchronization in the C-band spectrum, but not so much in millimeter wave. But I'm sure it is an issue definitely with adjacent networks if they're.
Okay, we have a question with regards to the area traffic capacity. So this is simply, you have to build up a scenario, and that there's research going up where you analyze specific locations where there are many human users as well as other users, and you certainly get to a requirement to serve this sort of area traffic capacity. It's simply a calculation by saying, okay, in a stadium, how many users, people do I have if they do things simultaneously? How many network slices are being demanded? How many other users are there, for example, for cameras, etc. And you tot it all up, and lo and behold, you come to those sort of numbers of 10, I think it's 10 megabits per square meter, if I'm not mistaken, is the number. Is that not correct? I have that spider diagram right here. It's not 10 gigabits, that would be rather a lot. No, it's 10 megabits, of course.
Okay, Peter Lyons is asking, how does the upper portion of the millimeter wave band look compared to the lower portion of the millimeter wave? As far as standardization of equipment goes, well, there isn't much. It's all, most of the actions down at the 24 to 39 gigahertz range, I think, as far as sort of device availability is concerned these days. And that's where most of the spectrum, by the way, has been allocated. So, so I think, I think it'll be a while before they start, the manufacturers turn their attention to higher frequency bands.
Here's a good question from Peter Zimri. What is your views on the assignment of millimeter wave spectrum national versus regional / local? Do you want to take that, Scott?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, it is used locally and regionally. Just given its propagation characteristics, it's more likely to be used in urban areas, high density areas, or particular locations, football stadiums, concert halls, things like that. So there is an argument that at least part of it ought to be allocated on a sort of regional basis or a local level. On the other hand, the operators generally like to have a national license because they like to be able to know they're going to be able to use it wherever they need it in their network. And obviously, traffic demand can grow in an area or a region. You build a new industrial estate somewhere, and you need the capacity there. So I think a block of flats gets built or something, then I think the most operators would prefer to get a national license.
Yeah, and I would add this, that regional doesn't preclude national, but at least it gives the opportunity for somebody to acquire spectrum regionally. And if a national operator has no interest in the spectrum in a particular area, then at least it does find another use. Now, I understand that Canada in their mmWave auction is going to go down the road to assign the spectrum in almost 600 areas. And I think the US did it also at county level or something like that. So I think the going down the route of a regional or relatively small regional assignment is probably a good one, as long as this doesn't preclude national operators from acquiring licenses in all regions.
Okay, and I think we've got a question from Bashir Gwandu. Defining 5G, there are many that think it should have sub 1 megahertz, sub 1 millisecond, latency. How is that achievable with sub 1 gigahertz or even the mid-band? In modeling work where you said to achieve 10 gigabits per second in 1 square meter, you need millimeter wave. Can you explain how measured? Well, it's.
Yeah, I answered that. I think you just.
I think you've answered that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you take the traffic in an area, and so, for example, you have the area of a football stadium. You take the aggregate traffic, you divide it by the area of the football stadium, and there are various published examples of those sort of calculations you can look at. Yeah. One is a European study, actually, from memory.
Yeah, and there was, how is it achievable to get sub 1 megahertz latency? Well, you're absolutely right. You need these high frequencies to get down to that level. You need the millimeter wave spectrum. You'd be struggling to do it with even with mid-band spectrum.
Yeah, and as regards the use of millimeter wave for fixed wireless access, I think after the initial enthusiasm in the US, I think operators have dialed back a little bit. Although they were all out in force buying spectrum, it may also be a reflection of the fact that in the US you have a lack of mid-band spectrum. And we have seen the opposite of demand exceeding supply in Hong Kong, where the stuff remained unsold. So it may also very much depend on the situation in a particular country.
Okay. Yes, you said there's a question from Abdullah Al-Nasif. What is the best way regulator to evacuate existing services in 26 gigahertz to allocate millimeter wave and protect the existing businesses? Yeah, that's a good question. So there will be other microwave frequencies, microwave links that could be used.
Yes, there are various options. I mean, you could give people notice and ask them to move. You could have a commercial solution such as a reverse auction, as we have seen in the US for the 600 megahertz. So they're all the various possibilities of doing it, and it depends also very much of what type of tenure the existing services have. So that's a legal question rather than anything else.
Yeah, but clearly regulators do need to obviously manage this carefully. You don't want to leave existing users high and dry, and that's spectrum management is all about that. So And I think there's just one other follow-up from Bashir. As a follow-up to my question one, can we achieve 10 gigabits per second in the mid-band yet? I wasn't aware you could do that. So I think it's only about, is it what, 1.4 gigabits per second or something? I think is the best we've seen so far from, you know,
something like that, yes.
100 megahertz wide channel and massive MIMO. So yeah, without the millimeter wave spectrum, we certainly won't get near 10 gigabits per second. So even a millimeter wave spectrum, I think there have been some laboratory trials showing it at 4+ gigabits per second. So using 800 megahertz wide channel.
We have another question here from Greg about I think fronthaul or small cell backhaul, I suppose is the other way of calling it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is one of the use cases, but most of the vendors are touting this, but in practice we haven't seen much. But given the anticipated growth in small cells, this might be huge.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your interest, and thank you for all the good questions as well. So,
thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye bye.